When my sister died, she left me everything. And then, after 18 years of silence, my three children suddenly came back, calling me Mum again. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But something in their smiles felt practiced. Something in my chest tightened. I thought I was too old to be fooled. But what if the real betrayal wasn't just from the past, but was already waiting in my living room, wearing my son's face? I was still putting away the last sympathy cards when the lawyer called. My sister's ashes hadn't even cooled, and suddenly I was expected to sit in some downtown office and listen to her final wishes. I hadn't slept much. The house felt hollow without Beatrice. For 19 years, she was the one constant thing in my life after my children left. She didn't hug, she didn't coddle, but she never walked away. That morning, I put on the navy suit she always said made me look like a woman with boundaries. I sat in the car for 10 full minutes before turning the key. It was strange, knowing everything that once belonged to her would now have my name on it. The house, the buildings, the accounts, all of it. I never asked for any of it. I just wanted her to stay a little longer. The office was quiet. Leather chairs, heavy wood furniture, the kind of place where nothing rushed, not even grief. Harold Bennett, her longtime attorney, greeted me like a familiar storm. Firm handshake, no small talk. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, folding my hands in my lap like I was back in church. He began reading the will, line by line, with that dry lawyer tone that strips emotion from even the deepest intentions. Beatrice left everything to me. Every property, every dollar, every dusty antique vase and million-dollar parcel of land. It felt surreal. She had warned me in her own way. Little comments over tea, notes scribbled in margins. But hearing it said aloud still pulled something deep inside me. There was a moment of silence when Harold closed the folder. Then came the knock. The door opened, and time stood still. Gregory stepped in first, his shoulders broader, his hair thinner. But that same walk, that same confident smirk dressed up as concern. Susan followed, thin, tightly wound, her smile stretched too far. And Philip, the youngest, hovered in the back like he always did. I hadn't seen them in 18 years. Not once. No calls, no holidays, not even a postcard. Gregory said my name like he'd just seen me yesterday. Susan called me Mum. I didn't answer. Harold stood, surprised, but not enough to forget his manners. He gestured to the empty chairs. They sat down like it was their right, like they belonged there. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. Susan reached for my hand across the table. I pulled it back without thinking. Philip said something about the obituary, how they had seen it, how they had meant to come sooner. My eyes were fixed on Harold. He looked back at me with a question in his eyes, but I didn't nod. Gregory cleared his throat and said he was sorry for everything, that they were here now, that they wanted to help. I think he even said something about rebuilding. I remember thinking, why now? Then I remembered something Beatrice once told me. When people show up suddenly, it's never sudden. It's planned. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for explanations. I let them talk. They said they had changed. Life had taught them lessons. They wanted to be a family again. They asked if I was eating well, if the house felt too big now, if I needed anything. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about me. It was about the will. It was about everything Beatrice left behind. Harold finally spoke, thanking them for their concern, but explaining that the estate had already been lawfully transferred. Gregory nodded slowly, like he expected that answer. Susan looked disappointed, but not surprised. And Philip, he never did look me in the eye. After they left, Harold turned to me. He asked if I wanted to contest their presence. I said no, because something in their voices told me this wasn't the last time I would see them. If you're still listening, tell me something. Have you ever had someone come back into your life, not because they missed you, but because they realized you had something they wanted? If you have, I hope you chose yourself, like I'm about to. Stay with me. This story is only just beginning. It happened in the kitchen, the day everything shifted. I remember the light slanting across the tile, the kettle starting to whistle, and Beatrice standing by the sink with a glass of water she hadn't touched. Her hair was pinned back too tightly, like always, her mouth drawn in that thin, unreadable line. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just stared at the faucet and said, "You'll stay here now. I've already had the locks changed. That was 18 years ago. Back then, I was still shaking from what happened the week before. The night Gregory told me to pack a bag. The way Susan tossed a folded blanket on the floor like it was a favor. The way Philip wouldn't even say goodbye. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of them. But I did what they asked. I left my own house with a duffel bag and a jacket, and I walked 4 blocks in the dark to a gas station, trying to remember who else I could call. It was Beatrice who picked up. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask if I was okay. She said, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." And she did. She drove up in that old black sedan with the engine that rattled like coins in a jar. She unlocked the passenger door from the inside and waited. When I sat down, she didn't look at me. She just handed me a paper cup of tea and drove us back to her house. That night, I slept in the guest room under a quilt Beatrice had folded herself. She didn't say much. She never did. But the next morning, there were fresh eggs on the counter, and she had stocked the fridge with the things I liked: strawberry jam, whole milk, plain yogurt, the quiet way she cared. I stayed in that house, and the seasons changed. And with every passing day, she didn't ask when I was leaving. People talk about pain like it's sharp, like it stabs. But mine didn't feel like that. It felt dull, thick, like walking into the ocean fully clothed, heavy and slow and impossible to shake off. It wasn't just the way they pushed me out. It was the way they made it feel reasonable, like it was the natural next step, like I should have seen it coming. Gregory said I was too anxious, that I hovered too much. Susan said I was draining. Philip didn't say anything at all. I remember the way he looked at me that last night, like I was already gone. Beatrice didn't ask for the details, but she understood more than she let on. I think that's what saved me. Her silence was never indifferent. It was shelter. I began helping her around the house, organizing files, watering the plants. She would leave small notes for me, always on yellow paper, always signed with just a B. At first, I tried to talk more, tried to fill the silence. But eventually I learned that quiet could be a kindness. A year passed like that, then another. Eventually we stopped referring to it as temporary. She moved my things from the guest room to the west bedroom, gave me a key of my own. We developed our own rhythm. Morning walks, grocery lists, shared looks across the dinner table when the news anchor said something ridiculous. We never said the word family, but I think we both understood it in our own way. What I didn't expect, what I never once anticipated, was that Beatrice would leave everything to me. She had other options: distant cousins, old colleagues, charities she supported. But she chose me. I remember one evening, maybe 10 years after I moved in, she was sitting in the sunroom with a glass of red wine. She didn't drink often, and when she did, she became slightly looser, though never unguarded. That night, she said something I never forgot. "You stayed." That's all it ever came down to. Everyone else left. You stayed. She said it like a fact, not praise, not sentiment, just something that was true. And that's what I held on to now. As I sat in her kitchen alone, 18 years after she rescued me, trying to understand why my children had walked back into my life like they hadn't slammed the door shut behind them, I remembered those words. You stayed. Maybe that was what scared them most, that I had survived without them, that I had found something steadier, something stronger, without needing their permission. Because the truth is, I did want them back. For years. I dreamed about it, rehearsed conversations in my head, thought of birthdays, weddings, grandchildren, all the moments I thought I'd missed. But now, here they were, unannounced and overly sweet, saying all the right words in all the wrong ways. It wasn't reunion they wanted. It was recovery of the things they thought they'd lost, or could still take. And I wasn't the same woman who had begged them to stay. I was someone who had learned how to live inside silence, who had learned that quiet does not mean powerless, who had learned that staying is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. The envelope wasn't thick. It was standard ivory stock, the kind Beatrice used for thank you notes and holiday cards. My name was written in her careful, slanted script across the front. No decoration, no extra weight. But my hand trembled as I held it. Harold handed it to me after the will reading. He didn't say much, just that Beatrice had left instructions for me to read it privately. I waited until I got home. I needed the silence of the house to open it. I needed to hear her voice in my head again, before I heard what she had left behind in words. The letter inside was brief. 4 paragraphs. Every word chosen with care, like everything she did. She said she knew the return of my children would stir up more than old feelings. That grief, mixed with unresolved love, was the perfect storm for guilt. She reminded me, in that practical tone only she could manage, that guilt was not the same thing as trust, and that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. She wrote that she left everything to me not just out of love, but out of principle. Because I had been the one who stayed. Because I had been the one who gave, even when I had nothing left to offer. Because she wanted me to know that what I did mattered. She ended the letter with a line that made me pause longer than I expected. You deserve to live without always waiting for the next door to close. I read that line 3 times, because I knew what she meant. For years, even inside her home, I had lived like I might be asked to leave again. I folded my grief. I tiptoed through quiet rooms. I treated her generosity like a loan I couldn't repay. But Beatrice had seen right through it. And now, with her gone, she was still offering me something I hadn't fully taken before. A place to stay. A place to belong. I folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of the desk in the study. Then I sat down and opened the file folder Harold had also given me. It was full of bank statements, property deeds, insurance documents. All of it now in my name. My hands moved through them like they belonged to someone else. I was a retired administrative coordinator, not someone meant to own 6 commercial buildings and acres of real estate. But Beatrice had left no gaps. Everything had a note, a tab, an explanation. And then, tucked in the back, I found a smaller envelope. No name, no address, just a sticky note attached that read, "Open only if they come back." It wasn't sealed. I slid the letter out and read it once, slowly. It was written 2 years ago. Beatrice had seen something coming, even before her final diagnosis. She had suspected that if news of her death reached my children, they might return. And she had prepared for that. In the letter, she detailed steps she had taken. Legal protections, ownership transfers that couldn't be reversed, a clause in her business agreements that named me as sole trustee of her charitable funds. But it wasn't the legal content that shook me. It was her clarity. She wrote that people who abandon their parents rarely return for love. That regret is loud when wealth is involved, and that I should not mistake their tears for truth unless their actions had changed. Her words didn't soften the ache in my chest, but they did steady it. I placed both letters back in the folder and slid it into the locked cabinet near the fireplace. Then I made tea, sat in her chair, listened to the clock tick, and for the first time in days, I let myself breathe. The next morning, I walked the property. The house sat on a gentle slope, backed by a field of trimmed grass and a row of pines. Beatrice had always kept it tidy, not fancy, just clean, the way she liked everything. I stopped near the old stone bench under the elm tree and looked out at the land. Somewhere, beneath all of this, was the version of me who used to believe my children would come back because they missed me. But that version of me had been slowly fading for years. I wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expect. Anger had been spent long ago. What remained was a quieter feeling. Not bitterness, but distance, like a door gently closed and locked from the inside. I didn't hate them, but I no longer needed them to prove they loved me. I needed to prove something to myself instead. Inside the house, the air still held her scent. Sandalwood and mint. I sat down at the kitchen table with a fresh notebook. I opened to a blank page, and I began writing down every property, every tenant name, every renewal date, every pending issue she had marked. Not because I was afraid of managing it all, but because I had decided I would not let what she left be reduced to a transaction. I would know every detail. I would carry it the way she did, with discipline, with integrity, with calm. That evening, the phone rang. It was Susan. I let it go to voicemail. Then the text came. "We just want to talk, Mum. We were thinking of staying in town a little longer. Maybe stop by tomorrow." I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't expect it, but because even now, a part of me wanted it to mean something good. Then I remembered what Beatrice said. You deserve to live without always waiting for the next door to close. And I placed the phone face down. I was not the same woman they left behind. And this time, I would not wait for them to choose me again. They showed up that afternoon. I heard the knock first, steady and polite. 3 soft raps, the kind meant to sound respectful, not desperate. I knew it was them. Something in my chest tightened as I walked toward the front door. I had already turned down Susan's message the day before, but I also knew them well enough to expect persistence. When I opened the door, Gregory was the first to smile. He stood there in a beige jacket, sleeves rolled up neatly, like he had just stepped out of some casual business meeting. Susan stood behind him, clutching a paper bag from a bakery downtown. The smell of butter and sugar wafted toward me. And Philip, as always, was slightly off to the side, looking down at his shoes until he noticed me staring. I didn't step aside to let them in. Gregory cleared his throat. He said they were staying at the Lakefield Inn for a few days, just to rest, just to catch up, just to be near me after so long apart. His tone was easy, measured, like he'd rehearsed it on the drive over. Susan offered the bag of pastries, said she remembered I liked croissants. I took the bag, not because I wanted them, but because I didn't want to give them an excuse to linger on the porch. I asked what they wanted. Gregory said they didn't want anything. He just wanted to check on me, make sure I wasn't overwhelmed, that I wasn't alone too much. He mentioned that managing an estate like Beatrice's could be complicated, that people might try to take advantage of me, that it might be smart to have family nearby, people who care. It was Susan who added the line that told me everything. She said, "Mum, we're not here to fight you. We're here to protect what belongs to all of us." I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the door wider and told them they could sit for 20 minutes. No more. Inside, they walked slowly, glancing at the furniture as if trying to find traces of their childhood that never existed in this house. I had made tea earlier, but had no intention of offering it. They sat on the edge of the couch, legs close together, backs straight. Gregory leaned forward slightly, folding his hands like he was about to give a presentation. He said they had spoken with someone, a friend of a friend, a man who worked in estate planning. He said that depending on how Beatrice had structured her affairs, there could be options, adjustments, that if I needed help managing it all, they would be happy to assist. Susan chimed in, saying that Beatrice was their aunt too, that they had loved her, even if they didn't always show it, that she wouldn't have wanted the estate to drive a wedge through the family. I sat across from them in Beatrice's favourite chair, the blue one with the wooden arms. She always polished herself. I let them talk, let the words fill the room, swirl around the edges of everything that had already been decided long ago. When Gregory paused, waiting for me to respond, I asked one question. Why now? He blinked, then said he didn't understand. I asked again, more slowly. Why now? After 18 years. He said he had been wrong, that they all had, that they had let things go too far, that grief and guilt made people foolish. He said they had grown, learned things, lived hard years, that they missed me. I asked him to name the last book I read. He couldn't. I asked Susan to describe my favourite meal. She guessed pot roast. It wasn't even close. I asked Philip to look me in the eye. He tried. He failed. I stood up. I told them I wasn't angry, that anger had left me years ago. I told them I didn't need their help, that Beatrice had left everything with clear instructions, and I intended to follow them. I told them I had already spoken to Harold, and that the estate had no loopholes to squeeze through. Gregory tried to protest, said maybe it was worth reviewing again. Susan reached out for my hand. I stepped back. I said they had 15 minutes left. They used 10. They left quietly. No raised voices, no scenes. Just awkward silence and a final promise to call. When the door closed, I stood still in the entryway for a long time. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't shaking. I was calm, because now I had seen it for myself. The way they moved, the way they spoke, the practiced lines, the little corrections when one of them said too much. They weren't a family coming home. They were strategists, and I was not going to be a target. That evening, I went through Beatrice's drawer of old notes. I pulled out the folder marked Final Transfers. I reviewed the updated deeds, the retitled assets, the trust paperwork. I checked the margins where she scribbled reminders. Call Harold by Tuesday. File copies with Estate Council. Add clause to trust if needed. She had prepared for this. In her quiet, meticulous way, she had seen the playbook before the game began, and now so had I. There were no illusions left. I wasn't the mother they remembered, or perhaps I never had been. What they remembered was someone willing to shrink herself to fit their needs. But that woman no longer lived here. This house, this name, this legacy, they belonged to someone who had learned how to survive without apologies. Gregory would try again. I could feel it. Susan might send a letter. Philip might retreat and return later with softer words. But it wouldn't matter. The door had opened, I had looked them in the eye, and I had closed it again, not with anger, but with clarity. And that kind of peace, once earned, is not something I was ever going to give back. The next morning I woke up to find Gregory's car already parked across the street. He wasn't alone this time. A tall man in a blazer stood beside him, speaking quickly, motioning toward the house. I didn't recognize him, but I didn't need to. I had seen enough meetings outside the door to know when someone was preparing a move. I didn't open the blinds. I made my coffee slowly, deliberately, the way Beatrice used to. I sat at the kitchen table and flipped through the files again. The trust, the clause, the protection, everything still in place. My hands were steady, but there was a cold weight in my chest. The kind that doesn't come from fear, but from knowing too much, too early. By noon, the car was gone. I thought that might be the end of it for the day, until the phone rang. It was Harold. He said he had received a call from a junior associate at a local firm. Apparently, Gregory had begun inquiring about contingency-based trust disputes. They hadn't filed anything yet, but they were fishing, quietly, carefully, trying to see if there was a crack they could push into. Harold asked if I was all right. I told him I was calm. Then I asked him for a favor. I asked if he had copies of the letters Beatrice wrote when she first revised the estate, the personal ones. He paused, then said he would have his assistant deliver them by the afternoon. I stood at the window and watched the mail slot for the next 2 hours. When the envelope finally arrived, I opened it with a knife from the drawer. Inside were photocopies of 2 handwritten notes, one addressed to Harold, the other to someone named Elaine Turner. That name pulled something old from my memory. Elaine Turner, a professor. She had taught Gregory years ago, back when he was still pretending to be someone he wasn't. I remembered her coming to our house once, decades ago, after Gregory had lied about being accepted into an honors program. She had gently corrected the story, handed me a paper with red ink in the margins, and said, "Your son is smart, but he's also strategic. You might want to keep an eye on that." At the time, I had taken offense. Now I saw it for what it was. I called Harold back and asked if the professor was still living in Houston. He said he'd find out. 30 minutes later, he texted me an address. It was 10 blocks from my house. That afternoon, I walked. It felt good to move, my legs stiff from days of sitting in stillness. The sidewalks cracked from years of heat and tree roots. I counted mailboxes, watched a group of kids ride past on bikes, yelling over each other. Life going on, whether I welcomed it or not. Her house was plain, brick, blue trim. A flag hung beside the porch, faded from sun. I knocked once and waited. A minute passed before the door opened. Elaine Turner hadn't changed much. Older, yes, but the same sharpness in her eyes, the same patience in her mouth. She looked at me for a moment before saying, "You're Rosalind." I nodded. She stepped aside and let me in without a word. The house smelled like lavender and books. We sat in a living room full of armchairs that looked too heavy to move, but somehow comforting. She poured tea. I didn't ask for it. She just knew. We talked for nearly an hour. I told her everything. The reappearance, the visits, the man in the blazer, the subtle threats. She listened without interruption, except to ask for dates, names, timing. Then she reached behind the armrest and pulled out a folder. Inside were 3 pages, typed, labeled, annotated. She said she had kept track, that she had never thrown away the records from when Gregory was her student, that there had been irregularities back then, plagiarism, manipulated citations, even a complaint from a classmate that he had submitted someone else's work. Nothing ever proven, nothing formally filed, but enough to stay in her mind. She said Beatrice had reached out to her 2 years ago, just one meeting, over lunch. Beatrice had asked what she remembered. Elaine had told her everything. Beatrice never said why she asked. But now, we both understood. I asked if she would be willing to write a statement, not legal, just personal, something that showed a pattern. She said she already had. She slid it across the table. In it, she described Gregory's behavior over the years, not as a mother might, but as an educator, as someone who had seen the difference between ambition and manipulation, between brilliance and calculation. She described how charm could be used like a mask, how words could be weapons when wielded without conscience. I held the letter in my lap and looked up at her. She said Beatrice had wanted me to have support, not just legal, but moral, emotional. People who could remind me that choosing distance is sometimes the sanest form of self-preservation. I thanked her, not with words, but with the way I stood, the way I folded the letter with care, the way I met her eyes and did not look away. That night, I slept for 6 straight hours. No dreams, no memories, just rest. Because the armor was building, not out of hate, but out of knowing. Knowing that truth alone does not protect you. Sometimes you need evidence. Sometimes you need memory. Sometimes you need a witness. And sometimes you need to stop letting hope be louder than history. Under the soft morning light, I sat at Beatrice's desk and opened the manila folder where I had started gathering everything. The trust documents, the note from Elaine, copies of every message Gregory had sent, notes I had scribbled after each of their visits. It looked like clutter to anyone else, but to me it was armor. Quiet, measured, undeniable armor. That morning, I called Harold again. He was calm, as always. He asked if I had slept. I told him the truth. I had, finally. But not because things were better, because I was clearer. I told him about the meeting with Elaine. I told him what Gregory had been circling around, quietly behind my back. Harold said he wasn't surprised. He said, "Rosalind, this is the stage where people start smiling more. When they realize pressure doesn't work, they try charm again. Polished charm." I hung up and waited. By noon, Susan showed up alone. She brought flowers this time, yellow tulips, a little wilted at the edges. I opened the door just wide enough to block her view of the living room. She smiled like we were close again. She said she just wanted to see how I was doing. She said she remembered I used to love tulips in spring. I didn't bother correcting her. It was peonies I loved. Beatrice had grown them in the back garden. I didn't ask her in. Instead, I asked her what she wanted. She hesitated, then asked if I had heard from Gregory. I told her not lately. She said he was stressed, that he'd been looking into things, but it wasn't because of greed. It was fear, that estates this size attract bad people, opportunists, that he just wanted to make sure I was protected, that we all were. She emphasized the word, we. I told her I was fine, that everything was in order. She shifted, as if preparing for a speech. Then she said something that I will never forget. She said, "I know you think we're coming back now because of the inheritance, but maybe we're back because we regret what we did. Maybe people change. Maybe we've changed." I looked her in the eye and asked her to name the street I moved to after Beatrice took me in. She blinked. Her mouth opened, closed. I told her it was Willow Glen Road, that I had lived there for 3 years, that not once had she written, that when Beatrice sent them my address, all 3 letters either were returned unopened. She didn't respond. I told her I didn't believe people change just because there's money involved. I told her regret is a quiet thing. It does not knock on your door with flowers. I thanked her for the tulips and closed the door gently. That evening, Gregory called. I let it ring. Then again. Then Philip left a voicemail. He said he wanted to talk. Not about the trust, about the past, about healing. His voice shook a little, like he had rehearsed too many versions before picking this one. I didn't call back. Instead, I visited McClellan. She was the director of the local women's non-profit Beatrice had funded for years. We had met a few times at fundraisers, but we had never talked deeply. I brought her a tin of lemon cookies, the kind Beatrice used to send every spring. McClellan welcomed me into her office, a cozy space filled with books and photos of the women they had helped. She listened as I told her everything. Not just the recent events, but the long silence, the years of absence, the emptiness I had buried under routines. She listened without pity, just attention. And when I finished, she poured us both tea and said quietly, "You know, sometimes the absence of harm is not the same as love." I nodded. She said she had heard about Beatrice's passing, that the women in their shelter had cried when the news broke, that they lit candles and left notes in the front hallway. I hadn't known that. Then she asked me what I wanted to do with all of this. Not legally, not financially, emotionally. I told her I didn't know yet, but I was starting to understand that forgiveness and access are two different things. I could forgive them someday. Maybe. But I didn't owe them entry. McClellan said something then that stayed with me. She said, "You can love someone and still lock your door." We sat in silence after that. Before I left, she handed me an old photo. It was of Beatrice, standing on the porch of the shelter, surrounded by women of all ages. She looked proud, not of herself, but of them. That night, I framed it. I placed it beside the guest room door, the one I kept locked now, because love can be quiet, but so can boundaries, and sometimes they sound the same to people who have never known the difference. The next day, I received an envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a copy of a preliminary trust inquiry form, highlighted, annotated, and a sticky note that read, "Just checking options." I knew Gregory's handwriting, and suddenly, all the words from Susan and Philip fell silent in my memory. They had never been here to reconnect. They were still trying to get in. But now, the locks were stronger, and I had found something even more powerful than anger. I had found resolve. I woke to silence. Not the comforting kind, but the thick kind that feels like it's holding its breath. The house was still, but my body knew something had shifted. I moved slower that morning, not because of age, but because I was bracing for something I couldn't name yet. At 9, the doorbell rang. It wasn't one of them. It was Harold. He hadn't called ahead, which was unusual. He stood at the door in a charcoal coat, his shoulders tense, eyes tired. I let him in. He took off his gloves slowly, then opened his briefcase and handed me a thin folder. Inside was a copy of a complaint draft. Gregory had been working with another firm, one that specialized in elder financial abuse. The accusation was subtle, that I had been manipulated in my old age, that Beatrice had been controlling, that perhaps I hadn't been of sound mind when I signed the final version of the trust. It wasn't a lawsuit yet, but it was a warning shot. Harold said the firm had reached out to a probate contact in Dallas, likely trying to feel out the terrain before moving forward. There was nothing public yet, nothing filed, but he wanted me to see it with my own eyes. I sat with that paper for a long time, not angry, not afraid, just disappointed. It wasn't the legal move that hurt. It was the insult, the insinuation that I had not been present in my own choices, that my grief had somehow made me incompetent. After Harold left, I didn't cry. Instead, I opened Beatrice's old desk drawer and took out the notebook she had given me years ago, the one with the leather cover and blank pages. I hadn't touched it since she died. I wrote one sentence. If they want to test my memory, I will give them every page of it. I spent the rest of the day writing, not stories, not defense, just moments. Moments that proved I had been awake, that I had been watching, that my memory was not only intact but sharpened by neglect. The way Gregory had looked at the will when I first mentioned it, the shift in his mouth, the way Susan had called twice in a row only after reading the obituary online, the way Philip had referred to the house as a property asset during breakfast. Each detail, dated, each sentence, clear. By dusk, I had 27 pages filled, not to show anyone, just to remind myself that no one would get to rewrite my story while I was still alive to hold the pen. 2 days later, I received a formal request to meet with a mediator. Gregory's name was not on it, but the initials matched the firm from Harold's warning. It was phrased kindly, an invitation to resolve family misunderstandings without the need for formal litigation. I declined. 3 hours after that, I received an email from Philip. It was brief. He said he didn't know what Gregory was doing and that he didn't support it, that he had always been the peacekeeper of the family, that he wished I would consider meeting him alone, just for coffee. I didn't reply. I had learned that silence is not the absence of power. It is the presence of boundary. That evening, I walked around the house and looked at every room with new eyes. Not as a home, but as a place worth protecting. I made a list: locks to be changed, security system to update, mail to be redirected, neighbors to notify, not out of paranoia, out of clarity. Because when someone tries to rewrite your truth, they don't stop at one sentence. They keep going until the ending belongs to them, and I wasn't going to let that happen. The next morning, McClellan called. She asked if I wanted to come to the shelter's spring luncheon. She said they were going to honor Beatrice. A small tribute. A bench with a plaque. I said I would come. When I arrived, the women were already gathered. Young ones, older ones, some with babies in their laps, some with shadows in their eyes that I recognized. They handed me a small envelope when I walked in. Inside was a note, written by a woman I had never met. It said, "Beatrice saved my life. And because of her, now I get to raise my daughter without fear." I folded it and placed it in my coat. During the ceremony, I stood beside the new bench and traced the name with my finger. Beatrice Langford, a sister, a protector, a woman who gave me the tools to recognize a boundary as love, not distance. When I returned home, I opened the mailbox and found a thick envelope from the law office. It was marked confidential. Inside was a sworn statement Gregory had submitted preemptively in case of court proceedings. It was full of polite phrasing, strategic omissions, and one sentence that nearly made me laugh. He wrote, "I have concerns about my mother's capacity to manage such a large estate, given her current condition." My current condition. I sat in the chair by the window and whispered the phrase to myself, like it was a poem. Then I stood, walked to Beatrice's room, took the framed photo from the nightstand and brought it to the kitchen, set it on the table. And I said, out loud, "Then let them see what my condition really is. Because this wasn't grief anymore. It was resolve. And every step they took toward rewriting my story would only make mine clearer, sharper, unshakable. I wasn't done, not even close. Understood. I will now write chapter 8, following your exact instructions. Please wait a moment while I complete it. I hadn't heard from Philip in nearly a week. Susan had gone silent too. Gregory, of course, had never once tried to reach me directly. He preferred paperwork and insinuations. But something in the air felt heavier now, a pressure building beneath the surface. The pressure broke on a Tuesday morning. I was returning from the bakery, where I liked to buy fresh rye and sit for a few quiet moments with my tea. When I turned into my driveway, there was a black SUV parked near the curb. Two figures stood beside it. Philip and Susan. I didn't rush. I placed the bread inside the house, poured myself half a cup of tea, then opened the door and stepped onto the porch. They turned to me with what I imagined they thought were composed faces, but their eyes betrayed the storm behind the calm. I had seen this look before, many years ago, when they sat me down in their old living room and told me that I had to leave, that I was a burden, that things were different now. Philip was the first to speak. He said he had been trying to stay out of the conflict, that he had only recently learned what Gregory had been up to, that Susan had nothing to do with the legal firm, that they both simply wanted to talk, to find a way to resolve everything before it escalated. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. Then Susan added her piece. Her voice was soft, rehearsed. She said she missed me, that she had thought about me for years, that no matter what had happened between us, she didn't want to see the family torn apart now, when we had a second chance. A second chance. That phrase hung in the air like the scent of something sweet but spoiled. I asked them what they wanted, not with words, just with my eyes. Philip took a small step forward. He said he was worried about how the public would see this, that dragging a family dispute through courts would harm everyone's reputation, that people talk, that neighbors notice, that perhaps, if I agreed to divide the inheritance a little more equitably, everyone could move forward without hostility. Susan didn't say a word after that. She simply looked away, down at the walkway, as if embarrassed or defeated, or both. I took a breath and nodded slowly, not in agreement, in understanding, because there it was, not remorse, not reconciliation, just a calculated appeal dressed in the language of peace. I told them I appreciated their visit. Then I stepped back inside and locked the door. They stayed outside for a few more minutes. I watched them through the sheer curtain. Philip paced. Susan leaned against the car, arms crossed. Eventually they left. That afternoon I called McClellan. I asked if the shelter still needed help organizing their archives. She said yes, and offered to drive over with the boxes the next morning. I told her I would come to them instead. I needed to be around women who had seen what I had seen, who had learned to live without being believed. At the shelter, I sorted files in a small back office. Folders filled with intake notes, lists of emergency contacts, medical summaries, protection requests. Each folder was a story. Each one carried the echo of choices made under pressure, of women who had loved too long or trusted too deeply. I saw parts of myself in every file. I stayed late that evening. When I returned home, there was a letter on the front steps, not mailed, left by hand. The handwriting was unmistakable. Philip's. Inside was a single page. He said he had spoken with Gregory again, that he didn't agree with his methods, but he couldn't stop him either, that Susan was upset and didn't want things to turn ugly, that they were still hoping I would change my mind, that maybe I was just too emotional right now to see the big picture. Too emotional. Another phrase that clung like ash. I burned the letter, not in anger, but in clarity. That night, I sat down and made another list. This one wasn't about locks or cameras. It was about where my power lived. I listed everything I still controlled: my name, my story, my house, my resources, my voice. And then,